Here to tell us more about this particular assessment is Dr. Lynn Kuok. She's a co-editor of this assessment and also Shangri-La Dialogue Senior Fellow. And you've worked very hard to put this book together. So it's quite a thick, report. So all in, what would you say are some of the most important findings from your assessment?
Thanks so much, Oteli. We did work very hard, the team and I, my co-editor, we did work very hard in that. And I think some of the key findings of this assessment are, first, despite the war in Ukraine, I think China, because of its strategic extroversion, its ambitions, China continues to remain the leading challenge in China, in the region. Second, although we should be drawing lessons from Ukraine with some caution, I think what we can see is that the war in Ukraine has enhance the propensity towards military spending, as well as the desire of governments within the region to boost military capacity. So, for instance, we saw Japan issue its national security strategy in December 2022, doubling its defense expenditure. And third, I think we should look at the issue of Taiwan quite carefully. Last year at the Shangri-La Dialogue, the Prime Minister of Japan actually talked about how Ukraine today might be East Asia tomorrow, whereas he is correct in saying that, a war in the region might be more likely if we allow the rules-based order to deteriorate. I think it would be wrong to draw a straight line between Russia's invasion of Ukraine and China's potential invasion of Taiwan. I do not think that China would be factoring in the war in Ukraine as much as some would think. I think the main consideration for China would be, first, whether or not it has the military capacity to win in a quick war against Taiwan, which will likely involve the United States, and two, whether or not any of its red lines in respect of Taiwanese independence being declared, whether that's crossed. And of course, I think a final important key finding would be that the report finds no strategic alignment with the United States, or there hasn't been a general strategic alignment with the United States, even though countries in the region are worried about China's behavior in the region. So they still prefer to avoid having to choose between the United States and China.
But having said that, I mean, like China, well, we know like the US, for instance, they've gone to a lot of wars. We know their capabilities, but China hasn't since 1979. So all this military might, all this military spending, I mean, to what extent would you say it's absolutely necessary?
I think countries will view it as being necessary to deter war, not because they want to bring us to the brink of war, but they're worried about developments in the region. And I think the general view is that, spending on defense, spending on deterrence is the best way of avoiding a war even beyond the next few decades.
And the Shangri-La Dialogue, I mean, it's also a platform for smaller countries, right? I mean, to have a voice, to have all these bilateral discussion. But do you see that, increasingly it's like autocracy versus democracy? That as much as ASEAN says, we want to sit on the fence, but, you can't do that for much longer.
I think we shouldn't be confusing the issue of autocracies versus democracies and sitting on the fence. I think framing the geopolitical competition as autocracies versus democracies is a dangerous framing. I don't think the United States quarrel with with China, when it comes down to it, is essentially about systems of government. I think what we're looking at is great power competition. In some respects, but also about, ensuring that the rules-based order is promoted and defended. And I think that's ultimately what some of the competition is around, or what some of the quarrel is around. In terms of whether Southeast Asian countries need or even ASEAN need to take a firmer stance to move away from the position of not wanting to choose, I think perhaps they are right not to say. They are right to say that they shouldn't have to choose between the United States and China. I think how they should think about the choice before them is about choosing between a state where it's the law of the jungle and might is right versus, the rules-based order and all countries as equal sovereign nations having, the freedom to choose their choices and their outcomes. I think that's the way they should think about them. So a choice between the law of the jungle and the rule of law.
And we've seen, just very recently, a couple of days ago, when we saw, again, sort of dangerous maneuvers by, a Chinese pilot above, just right above the South China Sea. When this sort of near skirmishes sort of happen, there is a real risk that there is that accidental conflict.
Yeah. Absolutely. I think the last time there was, in 2001, we had a U.S. spy plane almost accidentally collide with a Chinese aircraft just off Hainan. And in that case, that led to a diplomatic spat. But the relations between the United States and China then were far more placid. They were more cordial. If that were to happen again, I think it would be far more difficult. I think we've had people like the U.S. Indo-Pacific Commander, Admiral Aquilino, speak at the IISS before, where he talks about the lack of communication between China and the United States. And so what happens in a situation where there is a near collision or an actual collision? Will the two countries be able to speak and resolve the crisis so that, they are able to tamper down tensions and avoid escalation? And so I think that's what we might see at the dialogue as well, a talk about, putting in place guardrails to prevent the escalation of conflict. And I think what we will also see is countries talking about, yes, there will be competition. Yes, countries will seek to compete. Yes, they might sometimes even have nasty rhetoric against each other, although that's not ideal. But ultimately, there needs to be guardrails, including adherence to the rule of law, so that whatever quarrels we have do not escalate into open conflict.
And we will be, watching very closely, headline speeches and see how they craft their messages, whether new language is being used to, frame their statements. So I guess just before I let you go, Lynn, this book that you have worked so hard on, this assessment, what is the biggest impact you hope that it will have for the future?
I mentioned some of the takeaways from the Asia-Pacific Regional Security Assessment this year, and I think what's important is for some of your viewers, perhaps they could go online, get themselves a copy. It's free to air, so read it for some of its nuance. Because I think sometimes, in the media, we have short articles with catchy headlines, and I understand that. But sometimes the headlines don't always capture the nuance of the situation. So, for instance, if we look at what Admiral Phil Davidson said in 2021, I think he talked about how China might have its sights against Taiwan in 6 or 7 years, and so that took us to 2027. But that was reported as China going to invade Taiwan in 6 or 7 years. However, I think if we take a step back and look at some of the analysis, I think what he was talking about ultimately was about China working towards the capacity to be able to wage a war should it need to. That's quite different. Capacity is quite different from intention to wage a war. So I think the intention for publications like this, and certainly why we work so hard to produce things like that, is so that we are able to bring to viewers and readers some of the nuance behind some of the developments in the region. And of course, the developments in the region are so important to the world we live in. And having an understanding of the world we live in is the very first step of actually ensuring that the world we live in is the one that we want to live in.
Well, thanks so much for clearing the air. So here's your weekend read. Definitely a book, sort of report worth looking into. And that I was just speaking with Dr. Lynn Kuok. She's the co-editor of the Security Assessment and Shangri-La Dialogue Senior Fellow.